And in the meantime, with the next presidential nominating conventions a year and a half away, here's where we stand on money collected and spent by Democrats in 1974. Some of the big operators include Senator Lloyd Bentsen of Texas, over $600,000 collected, almost $400,000 spent. Senator Henry Jackson, well over $1 million in contributions, but less than $200,000 spent. And the biggest one of all, Governor George Wallace, with a whopping $1,700,000 in 1974 money, of which Wallace spent a whopping $1,600,000. Wallace spent last year almost 3 times as much as Jackson and Bentsen combined. Although there's a Republican in the White House, this is a season of discontent for many members of the grand old party. The party is at an all-time low in public support, and many of its conservatives regard President Ford as far too liberal in his fiscal policies and in his appointments. A group of Republican senators told the president that last week in the Oval Office. Mr. Ford then told a conference of 2,700 Republican leaders gathered in Washington that the party must be broadly based if it is to succeed. The president was answered by Ronald Reagan, who spoke for the conservatives, when he said to the same gathering that a party doesn't broaden its base by forsaking its basic beliefs. So the president has a problem. And as Tom Brokaw reports, you can see that problem in California.
All of President Ford's problems come together here in Southern California, a region of far-reaching economic and political significance. Southern California freeways are lifelines. There is no practical alternative to gasoline consumption at whatever the price. So automobiles are a major underpinning of the Southern California economy. But automobile sales were off more than 40% last year. Of course, Southern California not only consumes energy, it produces it. And the administration would like it to produce more oil offshore. But many powerful groups are opposed to that. These people are part of an ever longer line in Southern California, the unemployment line. Now at 9%, unemployment is expected to hit double figures before too long. Southern Californians are confused and worried about what's going on in Washington. In a random survey, President Ford didn't muster much confidence or support, even in the heart of the Republican Party, Orange County.
Well, not a whole lot of confidence. I don't think he's being dynamic or forceful enough.
You asked me, did I have confidence in him? As a person, yes, but not really as a president.
Oh, I think he's all right. I have to give him a chance. I think he'll make it.
Do you have confidence in him?
Not really, no, not much.
Stuart Spencer is a top Republican campaign manager, and he says it is more than the economy hurting President Ford.
This is Ronald Reagan's home state, and Ronald Reagan is a potential candidate for the presidency, and he's indicated that, I think. And this is Reagan country, and I think everybody's California, particularly in the Republican Party, are waiting to see what Ronald Reagan's going to do. Basically, he got the knife to the president's throat, politically I'm talking about, and it must be difficult for the president.
As governor of California, Ronald Reagan preached the so-called 11th Commandment, thou shalt not speak ill of a fellow Republican. Not now. Now the former governor has a standby campaign for the presidency, and he doesn't hesitate to question Gerald Ford's Republican Party credentials.
I think there's confusion about that. I think some of the change in signals, possibly because there's been no explanation of them to the people, has the people confused about where he stands. I think the people are terribly disturbed, as I am myself, about a debate in which we find ourselves with little chance to be on either side, and that is a debate between a $52 billion deficit proposed in the administration's budget as submitted, and a Congress that isn't getting as much attention, but should, because their howl is that the budget isn't big enough and they want a deficit that will be in the neighborhood of $80 billion. Now, which side do you take in that kind of an argument? I say a pox on both of them.
What is your personal reaction to Gerald Ford?
I think Gerald Ford is a very decent and a very honorable man.
And you think that he is the kind of man that the Republican Party can rally around in the future?
I think this remains to be seen as to how the economic situation develops and what the administration does about it.
President Ford will be coming to Southern California at the end of March, his first extended visit here since becoming president. That trip will be part of the White House campaign to sell the president and his policies to various groups of voters around the country. However, if the economy stays where it is, and if Ronald Reagan stays where he is, it will take considerably more than a single trip to improve President Ford's standing in Southern California. Tom Brokaw, NBC News, Los Angeles.
May be trying to sabotage President Ford's plan to run for the presidency in 1976. A spokesman denied a report in Newsweek magazine that says Mr. Ford told friends he won't run. John Cochran has more on that.
White House Press Secretary Ron Nessen said that whoever leaked the story to Newsweek is no friend of the president. Nessen cleared Vice President Rockefeller's staff of any suspicion, but when asked about Ronald Reagan supporters, Nessen said, "I'm not going to go any further." Other White House officials told NBC News there is no evidence linking the Reagan camp to planted stories. But President Ford knows that Reagan is a possible threat next year, and some of Mr. Ford's recent speeches have been aimed at conservatives where the Reagan appeal is strongest. Speaking to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce today, the president was warmly received by business executives as he deplored big government spending and government bureaucracy.
I have asked the Congress to postpone action on legislation which would create a new federal agency for consumer advocacy. At a time when we are trying to cut down both the size and the cost of government, it would be unsound to add still another layer of bureaucracy.
The president is building some conservative support against a possible bid from Reagan. Just yesterday, Senator Barry Goldwater complimented Mr. Ford on a speech advocating national unity after Vietnam. Goldwater said if the president continues to show strong leadership, he won't have to worry about a challenge from Republican conservatives. John Cochran, NBC News, the White House.
Ronald Reagan today ruled out a third-party candidacy. There had been talk that Reagan might bolt the Republican Party to run for the presidency as a conservative next year. Reagan also said he expected Alabama Governor George Wallace to run as a Democrat, and Reagan said that would pose problems for the Democratic Party.
Today, Democrats are Sergeant Schreiber, who ran for vice president last time and who says he's being urged to run for president this time, and Senator Hubert Humphrey, who says he is finding it difficult to resist the pressure for him to run again. Former Governor Terry Sanford of North Carolina today became the 6th Democrat to say he wants to be his party's choice for president next year. Sanford says he's the man to take on George Wallace, whom he accused of practicing the politics of fear.
I don't think anybody's been willing to talk about him and face him, and I think too many people have been cozying up to him and afraid of him, and afraid that he's got people out there that somehow turn against you if you say something bad about George Wallace. I don't believe that. I believe he needs to be taken on. I believe he represents just the kind of spirit that we don't need in this country anymore, and because I'm the nearest thing to him in terms of service and place of service and time in history, I'm the one to take him on. Furthermore, I think any of the other candidates would make acceptable presidents, and I don't think George Wallace would be acceptable as the president of the United States.
Sanford says he'll enter at least 17 primaries, including the one in North Carolina, where Wallace beat him badly in 1972. Sanford says if that happens again, he'll quit.
Conventions are more than a year away, but so far we have about half a dozen Democrats saying they want to be president, and only one Republican in sight so far, Gerald Ford. Not all Republicans relish that prospect, as David Brinkley points out. David?
Senator Buckley and several other Republican conservative senators have met in private, looked over the political scene, and issued a call for the party in 1976 to have an open convention. That is, to throw it open to all candidates and not routinely to nominate President Ford. Well, all conventions in both parties theoretically are open, but in fact an incumbent first-term president usually is renominated without argument, and any party member who tries to prevent it is in danger of being cast out of the hall into the summer's heat and not being invited to the free cocktail parties. But some Republican conservatives are dubious of President Ford and fear he may be some kind of closet liberal. They don't like his huge deficits, the détente with Russia, the flirting with Castro, and most of all, they don't like his choice of Rockefeller for vice president. So they would like in '76 a convention open to all candidates, of whom Mr. Ford would be only one of many. They did not say so, but some of them are known to favor Ronald Reagan, feeling that he carries none of the stain of the big spending liberal, or maybe Senator Buckley himself. When President Ford is asked about this, he cannot oppose it. He cannot insist that the nomination be handed to him without an argument. So those who want a chance to nominate Reagan may get the chance.
As always, the governor spent a lot of time talking politics, especially about the presidential prospects of Governor George Wallace of Alabama. Wallace hasn't yet formally announced that he's a candidate, but as Kenley Jones reports, his campaign for president is already well underway.
George Wallace has delivered so many state-of-the-state addresses as governor of Alabama that most people have lost count. He delivered another one last month, and again, as so often in the past, parts of his speech directed attention outside Alabama, this time toward the liberal politicians in New York City.
I want to say this. They've listened to the New York Times so much talk about Alabama that they forgot about New York, and now New York's going broke and have to close down if they don't get $3 billion in the next 30 days. Thank goodness Alabama's not in that shape, like the city of New York is.
Wallace has been criticized for paying too much attention to national politics and to his presidential campaigns, and not enough to state government. Alabama ranks near the bottom of the states in per capita income and in health, education, and welfare services.
Wallace has a stock answer to the criticism. He says the people of Alabama would not have elected him governor 3 times if they had been dissatisfied with his performance in office. But the question now is whether Wallace can be elected president.
His campaign headquarters in Montgomery is gearing up for next year's primaries. Wallace, who says he is physically fit, is expected to enter most of the primaries with heavy use of television to make up for limited personal appearances. If there was ever any doubt that Wallace would run for president in 1976, it is gone now. In fact, he has been running since 1972. The campaign has a lot more money now than it had in 1972. Wallace is the first presidential candidate to qualify for federal matching funds under the new campaign finance law. He did that by raising at least $5,000 in small contributions, $250 or less, in 20 states. Altogether, the Wallace campaign has raised more than $3 million since 1972, most of it through the use of direct mail. It has been expensive. It cost more than $1.5 million last year to send out several million pieces of mail. But that $1.5 million won't count against the $2 million limit for fundraising, which went into effect the first of this year under the campaign finance law. What that means is that Wallace may quite legally wind up spending twice as much, or more, on fundraising as the presidential candidates who have waited until this year to start campaigning. The brains of Wallace's direct mail campaign is in a bank of computers in Falls Church, Virginia, and in this man's head. He is Richard Viguerie, the owner of one of the country's most successful direct mail companies, and a promoter of conservative causes. If Wallace should fail to get the Democratic nomination, Viguerie is planning to back him on a third-party ticket. Viguerie's sophisticated techniques have enabled Wallace to find new contributors and supporters from a variety of mailing lists and to find out what voters in different parts of the country think about national issues, the kind of information Wallace could use in the primaries and in the presidential election campaign. The Wallace campaign is so far ahead of the others in money and organization that some Democrats are already talking about a Stop Wallace movement. Wallace supporters call it a conspiracy.
I guess it is a Stop George Wallace conspiracy among many different divisions, not only the politicians, but the members of the Democratic Party and members of the news media and this type things.
The news media in this country has never taken me seriously before, but they're now taking the people that I represent seriously, and they're out to tell people all manners of evil about George Wallace in Alabama. The modern Paul Revere is going to be a Washington Post and a New York Times
rider, both riding a Volkswagen down Broadway saying Wallace is coming.
No question about it. George Wallace is coming. The question remains how far he will go. Kenley Jones, NBC News, Montgomery.
Nelson Rockefeller got the nod today from President Ford to be the vice presidential candidate in 1976. The White House issued a statement in which Mr. Ford said, "I am convinced that both of us can convince the delegates at the Republican National Convention that individually and as a team we should be nominated." Since Mr. Ford has not yet announced his own candidacy in a formal way, this just may be the first time that an undeclared candidate for the presidency has chosen his running mate. Julian Bond, the black Georgia legislator and civil rights leader, says he is going after the Democratic Party's nomination for president. In the course of making the announcement last night in Youngstown, Ohio, Bond denounced Governor George Wallace of Alabama, who also wants the nomination, as a hillbilly Hitler.
From the NBC News Center in New York and David Brinkley's Journal from Washington.
Good evening. President Ford said today that he will file papers later this week establishing his own presidential campaign committee for next year's elections. And he has chosen a tough Georgia conservative to be his campaign manager, Howard Bo Callaway, who is now Secretary of the Army. The choice of Callaway, along with other recent decisions on personnel, gives the president added power in the southern states, where George Wallace and Ronald Reagan are popular. Here's more on the Callaway story from John Cochran at the White House.
Secretary Callaway accompanied President Ford last Saturday to an Army bicentennial celebration at Fort Benning near Callaway's home in Georgia. Just the day before, Callaway had learned he would be running the Ford campaign. It was a surprise, even though the two men have known each other since their days together in Congress. Unlike some others considered for the campaign job, Callaway was available because he's independently wealthy and can afford to take it. White House aides say Mr. Ford also likes Callaway's style, that he's an enthusiastic salesman with good political instincts. Callaway especially knows Southern politics, and that's considered another plus, since the South is the stronghold of both Ronald Reagan and George Wallace. Back in 1968, Callaway managed Richard Nixon's campaign in the Deep South. But Callaway was never very close to Nixon, and he was not stained by Watergate. President Ford has told White House aides he does not want them to repeat the mistakes made by Richard Nixon's people back in the 1972 campaign. Mr. Ford has said he wants his campaign run outside the White House, and that would seem to give Bo Callaway wide power. Even so, authoritative sources say Callaway will report to President Ford's most powerful aide, Donald Rumsfeld. John Cochran, NBC News, the White House.
Get $1 of federal money for each dollar they raise themselves, but to qualify for those matching funds, a candidate must get at least $5,000 in contributions of less than $250 in each of 20 states. Governor George Wallace and Senator Henry Jackson already have qualified. His first formal move today in his campaign to win the Republican nomination next year. At the same time, the man who will run the election campaign for Mr. Ford said the president has ordered his workers to avoid campaign abuses of any kind. Tom Brokaw reports.
Dean Birch, the interim campaign manager, filed papers with the new Federal Election Commission, registering the president's organization as the President Ford Committee. Today's filing included a signed statement from President Ford authorizing the committee to raise and spend money in his behalf. Birch said the president has issued firm instructions to avoid campaign abuse.
He said, you explore the law, we go right down the middle on this. We're going to do it right. If there's any close calls, call them against me. And that's the operating thesis that we have. We're not trying to sneak around. That's why I'm over here filing today. We want to get our committee filed legally. And I am convinced that President Ford is committed to perhaps the most straight-up campaign that's ever been run by an incumbent president.
Birch will remain in the committee as chairman of an advisory committee, and the president's chief of staff, Don Rumsfeld, is expected to supervise the whole operation from the White House. A White House official said today that Mr. Ford is now planning to make his formal announcement of candidacy sometime shortly after the 4th of July. Tom Brokaw, NBC News, at the White House.
Shows that 40% prefers Gerald Ford as the Republican presidential nominee next year. Running second in this poll is Ronald Reagan with 17%. That is a drop in Reagan's popularity in this group of 15 points in 2 months. Nevertheless, Reagan is still in the running along with a lot of other people. And that's the subject of David Brinkley's Journal this evening. David? David?
Now, more than a year in advance, there are 17 running for president, planning to, hoping to, or allowing it to be known they are available. Senator McGovern, who lost 49 states last time, has asked his friends which of 3 choices they think he should make. 1, endorse somebody already running. 2, name those he could not support. Or 3, run himself. A Hubert Humphrey headquarters has opened. Whatever hopes or fears it may be relying on, it's there. Governor Anderson of Minnesota thinks Congress members monopolize the presidency and that more governors should run. He did not announce himself, but he is interested. So the list now includes Ford, Reagan, Percy, Benson, Jackson, Udall, Shapp, Wallace, Humphrey, Shriver, McCarthy, McGovern, Harris, Carter, Sanford, Anderson, and Muskie. 17. It is curious to see a list that long in a year when an incumbent president has already said he will run. And incumbents are always difficult to beat and sometimes impossible. But if something unexpected happens, those already in line would be ready for it. They include those who would like to deal with the country's social and economic problems. And win or lose, for those with a taste for it, running for president can be exhilarating. Private airplanes, limousines waiting at the airport, crowds to hear the speeches and laugh at the jokes, a chance to make a few points, fame and publicity. Plus the fact that this time, for those who qualify, federal campaign money is available. So, win or lose, they will have a good time, attract attention, and do it mainly with other people's money. John?
Congressman Morris Udall of Arizona and Terry Sanford, the former governor of North Carolina, both criticized the Ford administration today for raising the possibility that the United States might be the first to use nuclear weapons in a war. Both men are contenders for the Democratic presidential nomination. Udall told reporters today that he has raised enough money in enough states to qualify him for federal campaign funds to be used in the 1976 primaries. So far, Governor George Wallace, Senator Henry Jackson, and Senator Lloyd Benson have also qualified for the matching campaign money. Here's more on what Udall said today from John Hart.
Udall said it was cold-blooded for the United States to let the world think we might strike first with nuclear weapons. He said this strengthens the hawks in the Kremlin.
It's a basic change in our national posture, and I think it'll be very destabilizing for the whole world and will have serious implications in the future of the strategic arms limitation talks. I view it with great alarm.
Udall called his news conference to say he has to be taken seriously as a candidate now that he's qualified for federal election money. But he thought George Wallace was being taken too seriously.
The thing that's troubled me about Wallace is that he wants to be treated differently. If I can get 30% of the delegates, they'd laugh me out of town if I suggested that by getting 30%, I was entitled to pick the vice presidential nominee, write the platform, or have a right to run off and form a third party. I can't get away with that. If you get 51%, you're entitled to nomination, and if you only get 33, you're not entitled to the nomination. And yet, there's a feeling around, expressed in the Wallace camp, that he has some special status, that we've got to deal with him and give in to him and let him write our ticket and write our platform and pick our ticket if he gets any substantial support, and I don't think that's right.
Udall predicts there won't be what the columnists call a brokered convention, where the candidates make deals with each other for the nomination. He figures the long primary season will put one candidate within striking distance of winning on the first ballot, which is the only hope for candidates of limited prominence, such as Mo Udall. John Hart, NBC News at the Capitol.
Good evening. The 1976 presidential election got underway today as President Gerald Ford sat in the White House and said he will run next year. It was not the most unexpected story of the year. The president already has a committee working for his candidacy, but it makes it official. Mr. Ford is one of 4 presidents in this century who came to the office without running for it. And the record shows that all four, Theodore Roosevelt, Calvin Coolidge, Harry Truman, and Lyndon Johnson, were later elected on their own. Here's more on the Ford story from Tom Brokaw.
There was a minimum of ceremony today as President Ford made the announcement from the White House Oval Office with campaign officials looking on.
Today, I am officially announcing that I am a candidate for the Republican nomination for president in 1976. I intend to conduct an open and above-board campaign, both for the nomination and for the presidency. I want every delegate and every vote that I can get that can be won to my cause within the spirit and the letter of the law and without compromising the principles for which I have stood all of my political and public life.
Good morning, the President Ford Committee.
Today, the president's small campaign staff still was getting organized in modest offices 6 blocks from the White House. There are 4 principal officers of the committee. The chairman is Howard Callaway. Callaway is a former Georgia congressman and former Secretary of the Army. Dean Birch, who worked for Nixon and managed the Goldwater for President campaign. California industrialist David Packard is the finance chairman, and former Defense Department Comptroller Robert Moot is campaign treasurer. Washington lobbyist and political strategist Bryce Harlow is on an advisory committee that includes former Pennsylvania Governor William Scranton, who ran for the Republican presidential nomination in '64, and former Defense Secretary Melvin Laird, an old ally of President Ford. Chairman Callaway, who reports to President Ford or White House Chief of Staff Don Rumsfeld, discounts reports of Ronald Reagan's challenge.
Like anybody else in the campaign, you don't go looking for opponents. We'd like everyone to be supporting, and I would like the sooner Ronald Reagan gets supporting President Ford, the better I would like it.
But do you think that's a realistic possibility?
Sure I do. I think Ronald Reagan and President Ford both have the same fundamental desires for this country. Their approaches are quite similar. They both believe that America today is thirsty for leadership.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
The Ford people intend to build their campaign around the considerable power of the presidency. They're convinced the public thinks of Gerald Ford as being much more presidential since the Mayaguez and his successful veto fights. They figure his European tour enhanced that image, and a Middle East solution would only heighten it. Domestically, the president has started to emphasize his opposition to big government.
The business of government is to help, not to interfere with the lives, the businesses, the occupations, the professions, the family life of the American people.
It's no accident that sounds like what Ronald Reagan and George Wallace have been saying. Even though the election is 16 months away, President Ford's advisors figured he'd better move now to cut off any threats from the right. With the commitments they've received so far, they're satisfied they now have the situation under control. Tom Brokaw, NBC News, Washington.
Ford's campaign manager says Mr. Ford is still keeping an open mind on a running mate for next year's presidential elections. But Callaway added that doesn't mean the president is anti-Nelson Rockefeller, just that he's not committed to the vice president at the moment. But there was no question today just how much President Ford is for President Ford, next year's Republican candidate. Tom Brokaw has that story. The dispute over whether Nelson Rockefeller will be Gerald Ford's running mate next year is still going on in the Ford for President campaign committee. Last night, the president's campaign manager, Howard Callaway, told a group of political writers again that the president is keeping an open mind. Callaway added that Mr. Ford might prefer a younger man than Vice President Rockefeller, who is 67 years old. Tom Brokaw has more on the story.
Since this is the second time that Callaway has publicly raised doubts about Rockefeller's role, there's a growing suspicion that it's a deliberate campaign to satisfy Republican conservatives who don't like the vice president. Callaway and President Ford deny that. Today, the president reissued a June 16th statement in which he says he's confident that he and Rockefeller can convince Republican delegates that individually and as a team they can be nominated. As for Callaway, he didn't refer to the vice president's age today, but insisted that he and the vice president understand each other.
I just want to say that the vice president and I have been together on every statement that we've made concerning the vice presidency on the ticket. The statements that I think are pretty clear is that the president supports the vice president as a member of this team and in this administration. But as the vice president has repeatedly told me, he thinks it's better for the president to make up his mind, his decision as to who he might recommend, if any, to the convention at the time of the convention, and that it's premature to recommend anyone now.
A member of the president's campaign advisory committee agreed with Callaway's assessment of Rockefeller's liabilities today, but he also volunteered that Mr. Ford and his campaign manager are stirring up unnecessary trouble by talking so much. Tom Brokaw, NBC News, Washington.
Republican Party presidential politics today. Two of Ronald Reagan's most important backers fly to California this week to tell their man he'd better announce for the presidency now or forget it. And Vice President Rockefeller will break off his Maine vacation to talk to Republicans in Alabama and South Carolina who don't want to see him as President Ford's running mate next year. All of this is a little complicated but simple when compared with the problems of the Democrats. David Brinkley's Journal tonight deals with both parties. David?
The Democrats already announced as candidates for president, or planning to announce, or hoping to, or thinking about it, now make up the following formidable list: Benson, Jackson, Udall, Wallace, Carter, Sanford, Muskie, McCarthy, Bayh, Humphrey, Shriver, Church, McGovern, Shapp, and Harris. The Republican list is hardly a list: Ford and Reagan. Over the weekend, Southern Republicans met in North Carolina and pretty well decided that if Reagan does not announce soon, their list can be shorter still: President Ford, period. Because their Republican leaders are lining up with Ford, seeing him as inevitable, and if Reagan waits much longer, he will find his support so diminished that at the convention next year, about all he can do is sit there and listen to the speeches. They're sending a group to California this week to tell him that if he wants to run, he had better say so. He had promised an answer, yes or no, by the end of this year. Well, they want the answer sooner. The Southern Republicans are pushing Reagan because they're afraid Ford will have Rockefeller running with him, and they would at least like to have Reagan running in the second place if he can't make the first. The president's political staff is convinced he will be renominated easily, whatever Reagan does. And only the Democrats, with that long list of names, will have very much to have a convention about. Tom?
Veto their oil price control extension bill, as he has threatened. The White House said Mr. Ford's veto would not come before Saturday at the earliest. And the president went traveling today. He's on a 2-day swing along the West Coast. His first stop was Seattle. John Cochran reports.
President Ford looked every inch a traditional candidate as he accepted a salmon from Washington Governor Daniel Evans. Mr. Ford's political trip to the Northwest comes just one day after 14 Republican senators urged him to change the tone of his speeches from conservative to moderate. The senators warned the president that if he continues to talk about cutting back on government programs, he'll win the Republican nomination, but may lose the election. Even so, at a party fundraiser, Mr. Ford once again returned to his conservative theme, emphasizing his dislike for big government.
Too many Americans have relied too much for too long on the government in Washington to meet their demands, grant their wishes, and solve their problems. Thank you very much.
The president's speeches may not please Republican liberals, but he says his views on government are shared by most Americans. John Cochran, NBC News, Seattle.
The White House said today that former President Nixon has agreed to release some of his materials to the Senate committee investigating the CIA. The papers and tapes deal with CIA activities in Chile. Today, stopping in Oklahoma before spending 3 days in California. In a speech at the Oklahoma State Fair this evening, Mr. Ford said he is optimistic that a long-term wheat agreement will be worked out with the Russians. When he gets to California, President Ford will play some golf and make some speeches, but he won't take part in an important political meeting now underway in San Diego. Tom Brokaw explains why.
Asa Gerald Ford is the leading choice of California Republicans for the 1976 presidential nomination. Even so, the president decided not to attend the state party convention this weekend because he doesn't want to get into head-to-head competition with Ronald Reagan in his home territory just yet.
Howard Bo Callaway, chairman of the President Ford Committee, came instead, and he was immediately asked about Vice President Rockefeller.
can walk.
It is not the Ford-Rockefeller Committee. We have a great many potential delegates who are very much for Ford and Rockefeller. We have a great many who are very much for Ford and someone else. They're equally welcomed.
One of Ronald Reagan's spokesmen, Lynn Nofziger, is urging California Republicans to wait a while before deciding, but many have made their choice.
President Ford.
And have you supported Ronald Reagan in the past?
Yes, I have.
Yes, I believe that the president is the man to back for the campaign in 1976.
Still, Ronald Reagan has a strong following among California Republicans, and his official announcement would likely cut the lead President Ford appears to have here. Furthermore, Republicans represent only about 36% of the California registration, and among California voters generally, the president has problems.
The fact that he hasn't come to grips with the pressing problems as the public perceives them, the fact that unemployment rate is still high, it's very high in California, inflation rate is up, the public is concerned about the oil decontrol measures. They don't see his vetoes as being very decisive. It may win a lot of plaudits among the Washington, D.C. crowd, but the way the public sees a president who is constantly vetoing legislation as one who's really not finding the answers.
So, California remains a state of promise and problems for President Ford, which is one of the reasons he's spending so much time here. Tom Brokaw, NBC News, San Diego.
Vice President Rockefeller and former California Governor Ronald Reagan were out politicking today in Portland, Oregon. Both men attended a meeting of Republican county chairmen and other party officials from 14 western states. Tom Pettit reports.
Republican county chairmen and other party workers are the key to control of the next convention. Nelson Rockefeller is here to represent himself and Gerald Ford. Ronald Reagan is here representing Ronald Reagan. A planned, spontaneous demonstration was put on by the right-wing Young Americans for Freedom, which denounced Ford and Rockefeller as too liberal.
And I believe that our only alternative is to urge Ronald Reagan to declare immediately and run in the primaries in 1976.
None of this talk ruffles the vice president. As a man who fought the great ideological battles of his party, he once would have relished the combat. But today, his public view of Reagan is very mellow and almost charitable.
Well, of course I take him seriously. He's a good friend of mine.
I mean, as a candidate, sir.
Well, it isn't a question whether I take him seriously. It's a question whether he takes himself seriously and whether he's going to be a candidate. If he was that confident of his success, I'm sure he'd have announced it already. Well, I'm not given to instant psychiatric evaluations, so I'm not going to try to figure out what he was trying to say or what he meant by that. I try not to take myself too seriously. I think that can get pretty obnoxious. But I certainly take the decision that I have to make extremely seriously.
Republican workers take Reagan seriously, too, up to a point. But in this part of the country, they do not think he can defeat President Ford, or that his followers can dump Vice President Rockefeller. Tom Pettit, NBC News, Portland, Oregon.
Parties around the country are inviting what might be called a road show of presidential candidates to appear before them. In New York, many of the candidates showed up over the weekend at a party forum in Syracuse. John Hart was there.
Many of the 3,000 Democrats here want to be delegates at their national convention next year and found themselves shopping for candidates. The 7 candidates, having declared themselves worthy of becoming the world's most powerful man, found themselves in a chorus line. Above it all, the moderator, non-candidate Hubert Humphrey, whose moderating sometimes sounded like an audition, too.
Higher prices for oil, less money for school lunches. More money for bombers and subs, less money for grandpa and grandma. What should be up is down, and what should be down is up.
These candidates are not yet running against each other. They are all against poverty, unemployment, and having a Republican in the White House, each one giving different parts of the same speech.
The Nixon-Ford administration is what we're talking about. It isn't just the Ford administration.
We had phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4, and I want you to join me in phase 5 when we phase them out.
7 years of Republican administration have brought this country to the brink.
And we're going to get them together in 76, and the glue that's going to get us together, the economic mismanagement of this country by the Ford administration.
A do-nothing administration. One who answers the pressing needs of this country by no. Instead of a president who constantly and consistently tells us what we can't do, let's provide the people with a president who tells us what we can do and then proceeds to show us how we get it done.
He said, some of us must sacrifice to make our system work. Now, I'm always intrigued by that us. It never seems to include the speakers.
Let me tell you, my friends, when that's the attitude in the White House, we can all agree it's time for a change in Washington. Thank you.
Some of the candidates and their staff said there wasn't enough time here to sound different from the other candidates. And some of the potential delegates wondered if this was the best way to shop for a nominee.
I'm not really sure that it is, for the simple reason that charisma plays a big part in politics today. And the most charismatic candidate here today might create the impression with the greatest number of the delegates or people here. I think maybe the one candidate who was unnamed as a candidate was here today, though, in the form of our chairman of the meeting, Hubert Humphrey.
Now, I want to help my party, and I want to help these candidates where I can. I try to be fair with them as a moderator and give them a good cross-section of questions. And
you wouldn't be willing to help the party by being the compromise candidate at the convention?
Of course I would. I surely would. I'd take on that challenge, and I think I'd do a better job than I've ever done before.
There'll be as many as 30 primaries next year, and the candidate's trick is to win enough of them to be the clear leader going into the convention. If no one does that, the convention will find non-candidate Hubert Humphrey there, smiling expectantly. John Hart, NBC News, City.
Former Oklahoma Senator Fred Harris said today that he has become the 7th Democratic presidential candidate to qualify for federal matching campaign money. Harris has been running a shoestring campaign for 10 months. Today he said he thinks he's got the best organization going and that his views are acceptable, in his words, to the great unwashed. A Ronald Reagan for President committee was unveiled today in New Hampshire. That state has next year's first primary in February, and Reagan supporters say he'll have to get between 35 and 40% of the Republican vote to pose a successful challenge to President Ford. Last month, NBC News asked Republicans in New Hampshire for their views on Reagan and Ford. 53% were for Ford, 37% were for Reagan, 10% undecided. Reagan is expected to make a formal announcement of his candidacy soon. The other day, there was a newspaper headline saying that the Emperor and Empress of Japan were sampling American ways. They had tea with... And finally tonight, the story of a mansion that is not a home. It's a governor's mansion. It's in Sacramento, California, and Rick Davis will tell you the rest.
For most of this century, this was the governor's mansion in California, until the old place was declared unsafe. Now it's a museum. This is the new mansion, built along the banks of the American River. The problem is, it's a governor's mansion without a governor. Construction is complete and those 20-foot doors swing open, but Edmund G. Brown, Jr. doesn't intend to walk in. He plans to keep on living right here on the top floor of an apartment house next to a parking lot just a few blocks from the state capitol. The rent, $250 a month. Former Governor Ronald Reagan finds that a little irritating. This was the groundbreaking in 1974. For Reagan and his wife Nancy, it was a personal victory.
Want a couple more just to make sure now that no one would dare stop it.
But all through his campaign, Edmund G. Brown Jr. made the mansion an issue, calling it a Taj Mahal and a waste of the taxpayers' money.
I'm not going to live in the new mansion.
And now, $1.5 million later, the mansion is ready and waiting. It is 12,000 square feet with 8 bedrooms, 8 bathrooms, a 50-foot living room, a library, reception rooms, 2 kitchens, and a huge enclosed courtyard. But it lacks one thing: a governor. The bachelor governor of California says he'd rather walk to work from his 1-bedroom apartment than travel 20 miles outside of town. His critics say Brown is now the one guilty of waste, that the mansion is there and ought to be occupied. And leading the critics, Ronald Reagan.
I wish he'd go live in that house.
Rick Davis, NBC News, Sacramento.
And good night for NBC News. While Wallace has been traveling in Europe, another unannounced presidential candidate, Ronald Reagan, has been traveling in the United States. The former California governor is on an Eastern trip now that's taken him to New York, Philadelphia, and last night to New Haven, where he spoke at Yale University. Tom Pettit reports on the Reagan campaign.
Ronald Reagan now has campaigned in 30 states, by plane, by train, and by bus. But his best vehicle is the National Press Corps.
And no decline in the number of cars on the bridges or in the rush hour traffic areas.
For Ronald Reagan, this Eastern trip has been a smashing success. On one day, he was covered by the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the Wall Street Journal, Time, Newsweek, ABC, CBS, and NBC. For Reagan, like any presidential hopeful, happiness is a full press bus and plenty of photographers. That is more important than anything important.
Yes.
Reagan, are you going to run for presidency?
What?
Are you going to run for president?
Well, that's a decision that I will announce sometime next month when I've completed the speaking schedule that I have.
Are you?
The toughest question Reagan got was from a Yale University student, not a reporter. Question: what would you do if you found out your son was having an affair with Susan Ford?
Well, I happen to believe that whether a person is in public life or just a citizen, there are certain areas of their private life that you don't question and that they don't answer the questions if you do.
On almost every issue, Reagan is a bit more conservative than Gerald Ford. And he is deadly serious about wanting to be president. Tom Pettit, NBC News, with the Reagan campaign.
The main political news of the day was Vice President Rockefeller's public explanation that he has taken himself out of the running for the vice presidential nomination because he doesn't want the president to be burdened by party squabbles. But, as we reported earlier, Rockefeller didn't take himself out of the running for president, should that opportunity arise. And David Brinkley's Journal tonight deals with the new conditions which might bring that opportunity about. David?
With Rockefeller's withdrawal, there may now be 3 contenders for the Republican nomination: he, Ford, and Reagan. Normally, it is assumed from the historical record that a president can easily get his own party's renomination for a second term. But it may be time to look at the historical record again. Most of the record was made in years when primaries played little or no part in the nomination. Most of it was made in years when presidents were not as beset with simultaneous unemployment and inflation, tremendous deficits, taxes, and crime, and a loss of public confidence in their political leadership. And most of the record was made when the political parties were powerful engines controlled by a few leaders, whereas now they are smaller and weaker and the control is much more widely dispersed. In the recent historical record, Lyndon Johnson decided after the New Hampshire primary he did not want or could not get his party's nomination, and he withdrew. So it may be now that a president's renomination is no longer automatic and guaranteed. By withdrawing now, or being pushed out now, Rockefeller is in position that if Mr. Ford can't make it, then he can go for it himself. He might find it difficult to get it away from Reagan, but he is in position to try. So it's a 3-way race. John?
Actually, there are some new indications that Ronald Reagan's strength is on the increase. Our latest NBC News poll shows that, in contrast to other polls made last month. We asked a national sample of registered Republicans this week, on the 4th and 5th of November, whom they would like as their party's presidential nominee next year. Well, you can see the results. Reagan is 1 point ahead of Mr. Ford, but actually, it's too close to call. When we asked registered voters of both parties how they might vote next year, Hubert Humphrey nosed out the president, but again, that figure is too close to call. And when we paired Reagan and Humphrey among registered voters, 48% said they were leaning toward Reagan, 44% toward Humphrey. It's important to remember that this week's samplings were made 1 year before the election. Statistically, all those pairings you've just seen are too close to call. But the figures do show that as of this month, Ronald Reagan is being taken very seriously by Republicans and Democrats alike. Good night for NBC News.
Sergeant Shriver entered the New Hampshire presidential primary today, saying he doubted his brother-in-law, Senator Kennedy, would run, but saying he would stay in even if he did. Shriver further said most of those running were involved in Washington, as if that were some kind of stain that even the detergents advertised on television would not remove, and that he, Shriver, was not involved in it. Well, from this and other postures struck by various candidates, it might seem that Washington has become a kind of isolation ward for social disease and that nobody wants to admit any connection with it. Generally, candidates from outside of Washington are doing at least as well, if not better, than those who live here and are known to be a part of it. They include Reagan in California, Carter in Georgia, Wallace in Alabama. Birch Bayh chose not to announce his candidacy in Washington, but from the family farm in Indiana, away from the unhealthy influences of our nation's capital, since it does seem to have become the symbol of all that is corrupt, wasteful, unwholesome, and expensive. The other candidates may wish they could leave Washington and live elsewhere until the election is over, but for most of them it is too late. As yet, nobody has promised that if elected president, he will refuse to live here and will instead run the government by mail and telephone from somewhere else. They may be reading the public temper rightly, that Washington has become so unpopular with the American people that the way to get elected is to run against it, which is what they're doing. John?
A presidential straw poll was held today at the state Democratic Convention in Florida. Former Governor Jimmy Carter of Georgia was the winner with 2/3 of the votes. Second was Governor Milton Schaap of Pennsylvania, with George Wallace third. The Democratic chairman in Florida, Ann Kramer, said she was surprised by the poll and thought it pointed to a close race between Wallace and Carter in the primary next March. George Wallace said today that if he were elected president, he would recommend a constitutional amendment under which, he said, people would choose what school they wanted to go to, whether they were black or white. Wallace was appearing on Meet the Press. Ronald Reagan is working his way eastward across the country, and it appears to an announcement that he will seek the Republican nomination next year. Today, Reagan reached Chicago. Mike Jackson reports.
Ronald Reagan is not formally a candidate for president, but he's been talking like a candidate since January. His audience in Chicago today was small businessmen, and Ronald Reagan spoke their language.
Everybody in this country can have a bigger slice of pie if government will get the hell out of the way and let the free enterprise system bake a bigger pie. Thank you very much.
As a non-candidate, Ronald Reagan appeared this afternoon near Chicago at the opening of the Illinois headquarters of Citizens for Reagan. Organizers of the Reagan Committee in Illinois say that the Republican delegation to the Congress from the state has already thrown its support to President Ford in the 1976 elections. But they say they're not concerned about that. They maintain that Reagan's strength will come from the precinct level. Ronald Reagan has tried to counteract the concerns of some Republicans, among them Vice President Rockefeller, that Ronald Reagan appeals only to the Republican right.
We don't have to sell our soul to the hierarchy of organized labor in Washington. They're as out of step with the rank-and-file union member in America today as the Democratic leadership is out of step with its own party. The rank-and-file working man, he's ours. Today, the government...
These Reagan supporters say the primary elections in New Hampshire, Florida, and Illinois will show Reagan to be more popular than President Ford.
I think the president would reassess his prospects and conclude that the base of support isn't there, and would announce that he is having his name withdrawn from consideration.
Everyone around Ronald Reagan has decided he'll run. He hints broadly that he will, and he will make an announcement about that on Thursday. Mike Jackson, NBC News, Des Plaines, Illinois.
David Brinkley's journal tonight deals with politics and with that old political rule that you can't always predict how things will turn out. For example, not long ago, very few people were giving a presidential candidate named Jimmy Carter much of a chance. But now people are beginning to take him more seriously. David?
George Wallace, in talking politics the other day, turned his harshest words on another Southern politician who is running against him in the Florida primary in March, where in the past Wallace has been an easy winner. The object of his scorn was Jimmy Carter, former governor of Georgia, who is now said to have a good chance to beat Wallace. Well, since he was so rough on him, Wallace may think so too. There is some reason for his concern. At the Florida State Democratic Convention on Sunday, they took a straw vote of the delegates, and Wallace came in third with only 57 votes. Governor Schaap of Pennsylvania was second with 60, and Carter was far ahead with 697. All the other Democrats were far behind. Since the Democrats don't know just what to do with Wallace, they would be pleased to see him defeated in the primaries, solving what they see as the Wallace problem long before their Madison Square Garden convention next summer. If Carter should perform that service for them, they would not necessarily give him their nomination, but they certainly would have to take him seriously, even though the party's liberals tend to doubt his liberal credentials are suitably immaculate. But last time they found McGovern's credentials immaculate, and he carried one state. It can be, and often is, demonstrated coldly and scientifically that polls and straw votes taken this early mean very little. In a campaign like this, with so many names and so much uncertainty, no doubt they do get more attention than they deserve. Whatever they're worth, they now seem to show Wallace's fortunes to be sinking and Carter's rising. John?
Congressman Morris Udall said today that he and other liberal Democratic candidates for the party's presidential nomination might unite behind one of them if one of them wins the first two primaries in New Hampshire and in Massachusetts. Ronald Reagan was in Miami today with his new Secret Service guards, and there was trouble caused by a man who was carrying a toy gun. Reagan was unhurt and didn't even see the man, but it was a scary moment. Reagan, accompanied by his wife, had just finished a speech to about 400 supporters outside a motel. He had come down into the crowd to shake hands with well-wishers. That's where the incident began. A young man, later identified as Michael Carvin, a former college student, apparently pointed the toy gun at Reagan. There was a scuffle. Secret Service agents were all over him in seconds, while Reagan was being hustled away. Later it was learned Carvin had made several telephone threats. But nothing happened to anybody, and Carvin was taken away in a police car. All of this happened on the day that Ronald Reagan made the formal announcement that he is a candidate for the Republican presidential nomination, which means that Reagan's challenge to President Ford, which has so far been strong but informal, is now strong and official. Tom Pettit of our staff has prepared a campaign profile of Reagan, and here it is.
I've called this press conference to announce that I am a candidate for the presidency and to ask for the support of all Americans who share my belief that our nation needs to embark on a new and constructive course. I believe my candidacy will be healthy for the nation and for my party.
Ronald Reagan cannot be dismissed as merely an old actor, ex-sports announcer, and one-time after-dinner speaker. He is a celebrity politician who now must be taken seriously. At 64, Ronald Wilson Reagan is the same age as Hubert Humphrey. He is 2 years older than President Ford. He was twice elected governor of California. California survived, and he emerged with a national reputation, although his policies as governor are sure to be campaign issues. Since January, he has been touring the country, but he refuses to tell how much he spent doing that or what his income has been. He has raised $650,000 so far for his presidential campaign, but most of that has been spent.
Well, Tom, how are you?
After covering Reagan for 10 years, it seems to me that his conservative philosophy is very simple. His ideas are very basic, but he does not often fully explain them. Here are some of his views. First, Reagan on busing.
I think that busing probably was well-intentioned when it started, but I think it failed of its purpose. It created more bitterness than the very bitterness that it was supposed to cure.
Reagan on the energy crisis.
Well, I happen to favor the decontrol of oil. I happen to favor also the moving into the offshore pools of oil.
Reagan is for offshore drilling. He is against New York City.
No program of trying to prevent catastrophe can be offered until there is a guarantee that New York is going to reform what has brought them to the present crisis.
On foreign affairs, Reagan once vaguely suggested using nuclear weapons in Vietnam. He is strong for defense, but cool on the United Nations.
I don't think this calls for leaving the UN at present, although I don't think we ought to be tempted too far on that.
Reagan thinks détente with the Soviet Union has been a one-way street.
If détente was the reason why we thought it might be tactless to meet with Mr. Solzhenitsyn, then that's what's wrong with détente. We can and we must reverse the flow of power to Washington.
But his most systematic thinking is in one constant and very popular theme.
Government is not the solution. Government is the problem. What I propose to you is nothing less than a systematic transfer of authority and resources to the states.
Reagan's homemade economic agenda for the nation is to dismantle a huge hunk of the federal government and give it back to the states if they want it.
With such a savings, it would be possible to balance the federal budget, to make an initial $5 billion payment on the national debt, and cut the federal personal income tax burden of every American by an average of 23%.
If elected president, Reagan would propose to end all federal transportation subsidies except for interstate highways. He would eliminate all federal public assistance programs, including food stamps. He would eliminate all federal aid to schools and hospitals. That's your basic Ronald Reagan platform. How he would accomplish that, he has not yet said. Tom Pettit, NBC News, Washington.
President Ford has been flying around the country going to Republican fundraising dinners, and Ronald Reagan has been arguing that the cost of these trips... New York. Good evening. The political shockwaves of Ronald Reagan's entry into the presidential race were being felt around the country today by Republicans and Democrats alike. And not all politicians had the same view about the meaning of Reagan's decision. Some were for it, and some, including Vice President Rockefeller, sounded as though they were against it. All of this came up today at a meeting of the country's 13 Republican governors in Wichita, Kansas. Our man John Hart was there.
Like the hash browns at breakfast, Ronald Reagan is hard on the digestion of the Republican establishment. The day after Reagan announced, here was Vice President Rockefeller warning Republican governors about ideological extremes. He didn't mention any names.
No major American political party can long endure by directing its appeal to a narrow minority.
But these Republicans knew that narrow was his word for Reagan. And Reagan's candidacy has already divided these governors.
I think there is a danger that it might embroil the party in an ideological dispute, which we could not afford right now.
Nothing would be more destructive, not only of the two-party system, but of the Republican Party itself, than to become a narrow-gauge party.
We conservatives are saying there's no need to broaden the base. We have been, I think, correct on the issues. And now the liberals are also pointing out that we're going to have to be fiscally conservative. And I'm sick and tired of hearing about broadening the party base. I think one reason we in the Republican Party have so few followers is we've gotten to the point where we stand for absolutely nothing. And I think that's the reason we've lost the support of the American people.
There are 13 Republican governors left in this country, and they reminded each other that less than a fifth of the American people admit to being Republicans. And they should do something that the majority would like. They all agreed that doing something to the federal government is it. Cut down its size, its spending, its getting into everything. But they are into a serious argument over who will lead them to it. John Hart, NBC News, Wichita, Kansas.
The Gallup poll is out this week with some interesting figures on what people think about government spending. A national sample was asked if it would vote for a congressional candidate who wanted to spend more to bring down unemployment, or a candidate who wanted to spend less to help balance the budget. 42% favored the candidate who would spend less. 46% favored the candidate who would spend more. We'll have a report tonight on the travels today of Ronald Reagan. Wilson is one of 4 Democratic candidates who has qualified for matching federal campaign money. Senator Jackson is the subject of tonight's political profile by John Hart.
Henry Jackson grew up looking at the world through this window in Everett, Washington, where Mount Pilchuck and the High Cascades draw the eyes upward. It's the same view from the Longfellow School where Henry told the other first graders just how high he was looking.
Henry was a great one that he was going to be the president. I can see him yet the way you say that. I'm going to be the president.
His first grade teacher, Mrs. May Wellington, remembers him as just the average child. Jackson was raised on the work ethic. His father, an immigrant Norwegian, sold cement he'd mixed by hand. Jackson was known as a liberal, and at the same time a severe young man who, as county prosecutor, closed down the brothels and bootleggers who called him Soda Pop Jackson. Some people say the bootleggers helped him get elected to Congress to get him out of town, but there's no proof of that. In the Senate, he was put on the McCarthy Committee investigating subversion. Other Democrats led the attack on McCarthy, but Jackson can say he irritated McCarthy with his questions. Jackson opposed witch hunting, but over the years, he has remained a strong anti-communist. He saw the war in Vietnam as opposition to communist expansion, and he never wavered. When Saigon fell last April, Jackson said the basic decision to go into Vietnam was right. Energy is Jackson's main issue. He wants an energy mobilization board like the War Production Board of World War II that would commit the country to winning self-sufficiency.
We're talking here about the need to invest over the next 10 to 15 years for energy alone, $2 to $3 trillion.
That, he says, would end unemployment.
I would invest huge sums for energy, which will give us more than 1 million jobs.
On inflation,
I believe that the need is to shock the economy right now into some stability. And I would therefore freeze all prices and wages.
Jackson is against busing.
Busing has worked in limited areas, but our objective must be integration, not what we're getting now, resegregation. And we need to improve the quality of schools.
Jackson believes in détente, but not the way it's been conducted so far.
Without arms reduction, there can't be a détente or a lessening of tension. The rest of it is make-believe.
Senator, you're going to clean the window afterwards?
Among the Washington press and among some of his colleagues, Jackson has the appearance of a headline hunter. He arranged to have a gas station in Massachusetts cut prices for one day to dramatize his position on energy.
This isn't a gimmick in a gimmick sense. This is an effort honestly dramatized to the people of this country, the ripoff.
When his investigations committee went digging for Jimmy Hoffa's body in Michigan, he and the committee were terribly embarrassed when Hoffa was not found. The committee dressed him down. Jackson denies he was looking for headlines. Jackson is known in Washington, D.C. as a heavyweight. Ralph Nader surveyed Capitol Hill, and the Senate staff people voted him the most effective senator. He's chairman of two important committees, Interior and Investigations. He commands personal and committee staffs of 100 people with a combined budget of nearly $3 million. He is also persistent.
We're proud to cast 48.5 votes for a great American, Senator Jackson.
A persistence that drove him to hang into the presidential race 4 years ago after bad showings in selected primaries. At the 1972 convention, he was a leader in the ABM movement. Anybody but McGovern. He lost. But in 1975, Jackson shows upward movement in the polls, and he has more campaign money in the bank than nearly all the other candidates combined. And he will persist, reaching for what he has always wanted.
Henry was always the one that wanted to be the president. I don't know where he got the idea. But he liked that idea. That was being a big man.
John Hart, NBC News, Everett, Washington.
A Gallup poll out today indicates that Senator Hubert Humphrey has increased his lead among Democratic voters for his party's 1976 presidential nomination. The poll taken late last month shows that Humphrey is the favorite of 30% of the registered Democrats poll. That is up 7% from October. Governor George Wallace finished second in the poll, up 1% from the month before. Senators Henry Jackson and George McGovern tied for third place each, favored by 10% of the Democrats polled during November. Among independent voters, Wallace led Humphrey by 8%. Last week's Gallup poll indicating that Ronald Reagan was ahead of President Ford by 8 percentage points among Republicans was the major subject of conversation at the Southern GOP conference at Houston this weekend. The conference ended last night after a speech by Ronald Reagan.
The White House said today that President Ford still has complete confidence in his campaign manager, Howard Bo Callaway. Callaway raised some dust among Southern Republicans over the weekend because of his harsh criticism of Ronald Reagan. Among other things, Callaway said that as governor of California, Reagan was long on rhetoric and poor on performance. That infuriated many Southern Republicans who favor Reagan. Today, the White House gave the impression that Mr. Ford intends to remain above such exchanges, although he's not too pleased with the way Callaway handled the Reagan matter. John Cochran reports.
There was a lot of Monday morning quarterbacking at the White House today, with Ford aides in agreement that Callaway made a mistake by criticizing Reagan. They especially felt Callaway gave a poor performance when he tried to explain why Reagan was not qualified to be president, but still might be chosen as Mr. Ford's running mate.
Well, he's not my choice for vice president. He is acceptable because, compared to, he has done some good things. That's right. I just think that when he says that he's Sir Galahad on a white horse, and he's the wonderful guy that just lowers taxes and cuts back things, that part is not true.
A presidential aide said privately that Callaway was acting under White House instructions when he criticized Reagan. But today, a White House spokesman publicly tried to disassociate President Ford from Callaway's remarks. Sources say Mr. Ford believes it is humiliating for a president or his campaign manager to criticize a challenger, especially one who refuses to criticize the president. So the Ford strategy now is to tone down Callaway and to enlist other prominent conservatives to criticize Reagan. The White House is counting on the support of one of Reagan's fellow Californians, former HEW Secretary Caspar Weinberger. John Cochran, NBC News, the White House.
The short history of the Campaign Finance Act is instructive, and a good historian is Senator Pastore of Rhode Island, who worked on it. Here's what he says about it now. Quote, "The law is absurd. We created a monster. We have a law that even the people who wrote it do not understand. It's our own fault." Well, as for how that happened, it was a product of what then was half-jokingly called Washington's post-Watergate morality. Pastore says now, quote, "We were running like scared rats. We thought the tougher we made the law, the more the public would believe us. But I do not think they believe us any more now than they did before we passed the law." So, in his view and that of many others, a law hastily written after Watergate is seen now as having some good ideas and some bad ones, possibly including unconstitutional limits on free speech. But all the candidates have organized their campaigns and their financing on the assumption that was the law. And if the Supreme Court threw it out today or tomorrow, there would be a mess, another one. So the Supreme Court today said nothing. It just closed down for Christmas and left. It may have decided, perhaps with good reason, that the law ought to be tried for this one election to see how it works, and then whatever changes are needed can be made later, when Congress does not feel under such pressure to prove its piety and virtue. John?
President Rockefeller did some intricate politicking today. He told reporters that the Gallup poll showing Ronald Reagan ahead of President Ford among Republicans indicates that Reagan should be worried about peaking too soon. Rockefeller then went ahead and said some reasonably nice things about Reagan and about President Ford. John Cochran sorts it all out.
The vice president told reporters he still supports President Ford for the nomination, but when asked about Reagan's record as governor of California, Rockefeller was almost complimentary.
I would have to say that looking back, he handled the situation, which was a difficult situation in California, in a way that seems to have been well received in California, and that Governor Brown seems to be picking up quite a lot from him.
Rockefeller's refusal to criticize Reagan puts more distance between himself and the president, who is said to believe that Reagan is vulnerable on his record as governor. Rockefeller's independence is also a reminder that he is available as a candidate should President Ford falter in the early primaries. But Rockefeller strategists are concerned that if Reagan wins those primaries and builds up strong momentum, that it may be too late for a moderate candidate to overtake the conservative Reagan. And some of President Ford's moderate supporters feel that if Mr. Ford is going to drop out of the race, he ought to do it now. But the president has given them private reassurance that he intends to stick it out, even if the going in the early primaries is rough. John Cochran, NBC News, the White House.
In September, the Harris poll in a national survey of likely voters showed President Ford 6 points ahead of Hubert Humphrey in a possible contest for the presidency. But in the latest Harris survey, done about 3 weeks ago, the president's 6-point lead has turned into an 11-point loss. That is a swing in voter popularity for the president of 17 points in 2 months, a big decline. Further, the latest poll shows that Humphrey would beat Ronald Reagan by 7 points, which leads Lewis Harris to say it is entirely possible that neither Ford nor Reagan can be elected on the Republican ticket in 1976. We have another in our series of political profiles this evening, this time of a Democrat, former Senator Fred Harris of Oklahoma. Our reporter is Charles Quinn, and here's the profile.
Some years ago, a long time ago really, I told a little boy in the 1st grade, if you learn to read just real fast and work real hard, that you might be president of the United States someday. And today we have that boy here with us, Fred Harris.
Fred Harris has come a long way from that schoolroom in Walters, Oklahoma. He still has a long way to go. Harris is one of the darker horses in the Democratic race, a sort of renegade liberal, preaching redistribution of power and wealth.
Fundamental issue in 1976 is privilege. It's whether or not our government is going to begin to look after the interests of average citizens or continue to protect the interests of the super rich and the giant corporations.
Big is bad. Us against them.
Nice to see you.
That's the message Harris repeats wherever he goes. This is Greenfield, Iowa, population 2,500, a typical campaign stop for Fred Harris. Harris came from a small town like Greenfield. It suits his image. Humble beginnings, close to the land, and what he claims is a special understanding of the common man.
This is really a wonderful town. I just love the looks of it. Good to see you.
Harris grew up in Oklahoma. His father was a sharecropper, a man with a 3rd-grade education, who'd tell his son how unfair it was that so few people had so much money and so much power. Harris worked in the fields with his father, but he had bigger things in mind: college, where he was Phi Beta Kappa, and law school. Then began a career in politics, first running for state senator, then the United States Senate. Harris was an orthodox Democrat in those days, not a boat rocker. Today, his focus is different.
If we take the rich off welfare, by which I mean stop these direct subsidies and tax subsidies to the Lockheeds, the Penn Centrals, the timber interests, the oil and gas crowd, for example, if we take the rich off welfare, we can get this country back to work. And that's what I propose to you.
Harris is also unorthodox in style. He travels alone, without Secret Service, without national staff people. He flies coach. He's not easily recognizable as a candidate for president. He often campaigns with his wife, LaDonna, a Comanche Indian, who is active in Indians' rights and in women's rights. On most campaign issues, Harris is not far from the Democratic mainstream. Jobs. He wants full employment, a guaranteed job for everyone willing and able to work. Energy. He favors rolling back the price of domestic crude oil. He would break up the oil companies and make them competitive. Busing. He says enforce the law and end forced segregation. Inflation. He's for price controls on monopoly interests and for enforcement of antitrust laws to bring prices down through competition.
Many Democrats are skeptical about Harris, the maverick. They recall he was co-chairman of Hubert Humphrey's campaign in 1968, that he wanted to run for vice president, that he was something of a Johnny-come-lately on the Vietnam War. Some Democrats see Harris as another McGovern, a radical who can't win. Harris denies he's a radical, but he does acknowledge that many people don't think he can go all the way.
If the worst thing people say against you is, I think he's the best, but he can't win, all you have to do is show the slightest chance to win, and the thing begins to take off. And that's exactly what is happening in my campaign.
Experts are not willing to count Harris out, but they give him little chance of winning. Harris says the primaries will prove them wrong. Charles Quinn, NBC News.
Harris polls have published political surveys which conflict. The Harris poll, taken at the end of November, showed that people likely to vote favored Hubert Humphrey over Gerald Ford or Ronald Reagan. The Gallup survey was made among registered voters about a week later. It showed both Ford and Reagan ahead of Humphrey, the reverse of the Harris figures. Tonight we have our own NBC News poll made from December 16th to the 20th, the latest of the polls. Our telephone survey of almost 2,000 registered voters showed Mr. Ford and Senator Humphrey to be in a dead heat, 43% to 42%, too close to call. And our survey shows Ronald Reagan leading Humphrey by 6 points, 46% to 40%. All of this, we emphasize, the result of a survey made last week, the latest signal from the electorate in a time of rapidly changing political opinions.
And David Brinkley's Journal from Washington.
Good evening. President Ford said today that he expects to win the Republican nomination for president, face Hubert Humphrey in the election campaign, and win in November. The president, despite recent poll figures and other political difficulties, said, "I don't foresee any serious obstacles in the political year ahead." The president said that to a group of reporters, including this one, he had invited to the Oval Office. The president has said all along that Humphrey would be his most likely opponent. He also said today he can beat any Democrat. The president told us that under no circumstances would he drop out of the running, that anyone who believes he might doesn't know Jerry Ford. Sitting before an open fire, the president said his campaign organization is in good shape and that he would campaign affirmatively. He was given several chances to criticize his chief opponent, Ronald Reagan, but he wouldn't do that directly. The closest he came was to say that he knew some state governors who don't like Reagan's proposals. The president said he thought in terms of inflation and unemployment that the trends are right, and that he doesn't think the federal government will have to do more than it's doing now to stimulate the economy. On foreign affairs, the president said that the Russians are putting détente to the test in Angola, but that détente should be maintained as a policy. He did say the recent Senate vote forbidding covert American aid to groups in Angola has put the United States